the Executive Vice President of the Cato Institute, David Boaz.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ethel May. It is wonderful to have such an outstanding board of directors at the Cato Institute with people like Ethel May on it, people who have achieved something, people who have made it in the real world. I think we have no politicians on our board of directors. We have people who have been successful in life. In my notes, I call this speech, "Why Are We Here?" or "Why We Are Here." And it occurred to me, there was a time when I found myself in the wrong place, and maybe that happened again. I got an invitation about 5 years ago from a new think tank in Washington called the New America Foundation, which is kind of center-left, but they were about being hip and modern and post-partisan and everything, and they said they were going to have David Friedman speaking. And I thought that was kind of odd, but it said David Friedman of Santa Clara University, the author of The Machinery of Freedom, and so I said, well, I'm going to go to that then. And I was a little surprised that I didn't know he was coming to Washington because he's a big libertarian scholar. But anyway, so I went there, and it's a brown bag lunch, and that meant I had to go out and buy a lunch and go in there, and the only seat was over by the wall, so I had to sit down there, and it was very difficult to move around at that point. And then they brought the speaker out, and it was some guy named David Friedman, but it wasn't the libertarian David Friedman. But I was stuck in there in the wall, so I had to listen to this guy talk about how government could encourage better investment and better growth of Silicon Valley. And then I went up and complained to the president of the organization afterwards. That's not David Friedman of Santa Clara. He said, oh yeah, I know, an intern pulled the wrong bio off the web. Well, one of the jobs I do at Cato is quality control. And I'm sure we've made mistakes too. Anyway, about a month ago, I got a call saying James Franco would like to meet you. I thought, wow, I loved his movie, The Rise of the Planet of the Apes. So I said, okay, I'll do that. I was a little surprised it was going to be in Wichita. Anyway, here I am, wrong place again. I really need to start doing my research. But for the rest of you anyway, why we are here. We are here because we love freedom. And a colleague of mine said to me recently, libertarians are always talking about what they don't like about the government. They never talk about what they like about freedom. We only talk about stuff we don't like. I said, okay, that's a good point. Let's talk a little about freedom before we talk about the threats to it. And the biggest thing we should probably remember about freedom is that for all of our complaints, much of our life is free. Overwhelmingly, our life is free. We make thousands of choices every day. We engage in thousands of interactions with other people over the course of a day, a week, a month, and almost all of them we freely make. If freedom didn't work, we'd be in a sorry plight. But in fact, making all of these choices does work. So we ought to remember, and this is a response to people who say, for instance, that if the federal government officially is shut down for 16 days, that means somehow the country is shut down. Country seems to be going along pretty well. People are still making their choices. People are still making the things they make in their factories, in their lives. Freedom is what gives meaning to life. If all your choices were determined by some other factor, then how much meaning would there be in the choices you make? Freedom allows us to define our own meaning, to define what's important to us in terms of people and ideas and employment and so on. And freedom means respecting the moral autonomy of each person, seeing each person as the owner of his or her own life, each person free to make the important decisions about his or her life. One of the famous libertarian flags in American history is "Don't Tread on Me." Some young libertarians recently altered that flag. You can do everything with Photoshop now, to read "Don't Tread on Others." And that really is an important point. It's not just You don't tread on me. It's that I promise not to tread on you. I don't tread on others. So people who say that libertarianism is just a philosophy of self-interest, of atomistic individualism. No, it's a philosophy of respecting each person, which means respecting others. Each person free to make the important decisions about his life, to think, to speak, to write, to create, to marry, to eat and drink and smoke, to associate with others as we choose. All of those are part of the freedom that we understand by the name of freedom or liberty. Freedom is the foundation of our ability to construct our own good lives, and it has good consequences for society. Freedom gives us social harmony. We have less conflict in society when we have fewer specific rules about how we should live, whether that means religion or dress or lifestyle or class or schools. When the government runs any particular aspect of our lives, religion, schools, whatever, then we have to have political conflict over it. We run our own lives, we have much more social harmony. Freedom brings economic growth and abundance. We know that when people are free, as Adam Smith said, to truck and barter, they will make decisions that are in the interests of both parties to any agreement, and the compounding effect of all of those positive sum decisions is economic growth. In a free in a free society, people have incentives to invent, innovate, and produce more goods and services for the whole society. And that is what has taken us from a society not so very long ago of backbreaking labor from dusk to dawn to the incredible abundance that we see around us today. Ancient man was just as smart as we are. So what changed to take us from living in caves or huts or lean-tos to living in the modern air-conditioned houses and apartments that we do today? Well, what changed is freedom. The opportunity to use our talents and to cooperate with others to create and produce with the help of a few simple institutions and rules that protect those rights. When I was going on TV shows talking about libertarianism a primer 15 years ago, I needed to have, the question was, what is libertarianism? And the answer I came up with was, libertarianism is the idea that adult individuals have the right and the responsibility to make the important decisions about their own lives. And I think, each word in that description is important. It's about adults. Rules for children may be different. It's about individuals, our right as individuals to make these decisions. It's about our right to make the decisions about our own lives, but also about our responsibility to do so. It means we shouldn't seek to get somebody else to make decisions for us. In fact, you may remember a bestseller from a few years ago called All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. Well, there's a lot of truth to that. The fundamentals of freedom, the fundamentals of civilization, are things that you learned in kindergarten. In particular, don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, and keep your promises. If we live by those rules, we create a wealthy and harmonious society. But those aren't the rules they live by in Washington or in most state capitals. And that's part of why we're here, because we in our individual lives live by those simple rules all the time. And we want the government to live by those rules too. I also like Smokey the Bear's rules for fire safety. What did Smokey tell us? I think Smokey the Bear's rules for fire safety should also be applied to government. Keep it small, keep it in a confined area, that's what the Constitution does, and keep an eye on it. And that's what groups like the Cato Institute and the Kansas Policy Institute do. How do we do that? What do organizations like Cato and Kansas Policy do? What do think tanks do? I'm not going to give you just a list of books and studies and conferences and seminars and TV appearances. Those are all the tactics of what we do. But they're not the strategy. They're not the essence. We didn't used to have a blog, now we do. We used to have a national radio show, now we don't. Those things are just tactics. But I want to describe sort of some of the things that you might not recognize that we do. Sometimes what a think tank can do is give academics access to a wider audience. A year or two ago, I found an economist named Jason Taylor at Central Michigan University who had some interesting ideas about looking at what happened after World War II. Do you know what happened to the federal budget after World War II? It plummets because we've been spending all this money on the war. And we spent a lot less in the years immediately following World War II. And do you know what economists predicted at the time? Mass depression and unemployment when you slash government spending. And one of the things he said in there was, remember the Depression of 1946? No, you don't. It didn't happen. A lot of people predicted it, people who went on to win Nobel Prizes, but it didn't happen. So it was an interesting paper that he did for us, and from there, he got asked to write something about it for Forbes. He got asked to come and testify before Congress on this topic. He got asked to co-author an op-ed on the topic with his congressman, who is actually a House committee chairman in Washington. So one of the things we did for this academic and this idea was give it a platform that he couldn't get purely as an academic. We get libertarian, free market, limited government ideas into the state and national media. That's one of the things we do, partly just by being there, by being a beacon. Media know they can come and get a perspective, an opinion, because we're there, because there's a think tank like Kansas Policy in many state capitals or large cities. Sometimes we give people the courage to do what they know is right, and maybe the knowledge that there are better alternatives. Sometimes elected officials just don't know that you don't have to do it this way. Nobody's made that argument. We're able to make that argument. Sometimes they know in their gut they're not comfortable with what's being proposed, but when a think tank comes along with a study that confirms that their gut instinct is right on this, then they have the courage to speak up for what they thought was right. One of the things we do is we put big ideas on the table, ideas that probably wouldn't be there otherwise. At the Cato Institute, I would say, what are the big ideas we've put on the table over the past 30 years? Well, the fact that the Constitution delegates, enumerates, and thus limits the powers of the federal government. There's a lot more people in the judiciary talking about that than there were 30 years ago. The problems with the war on drugs, the benefits of transitioning to health savings accounts instead of employer-provided first dollar insurance, term limits for members of Congress. That turned out to be a very popular idea with the American people. It was only 5 justices of the Supreme Court who were able to stop it in its tracks. Social Security reform, specifically private accounts. And one of the things that issue shows you is how a lot of times what think tanks do is they dig into an issue not for a day or a month or a year, but for decades of research and advocacy. We published our first book on Social Security in 1980, and we kept on talking about it and researching and explaining the benefits. And eventually we had a president of the United States who more or less agreed with us. Unfortunately, he was a very unpopular president. And it turned out that having President Bush endorse our idea was not necessarily helpful. But that's the sort of thing that you work to get on the table of the national media, of the national policymakers. Here at Kansas Policy Institute, what are the big issues that they have talked about that you, because they represent all of you, talk about for years? School choice, privatization of government services, the costs of Medicaid and the dangers of the Obamacare exchanges. And sometimes we may come up with ideas that don't seem all that big and yet may catch on and make a difference. One of the ones we just sort of realized at Cato recently is one of my colleagues, Chris Edwards, floated the idea about 5 years ago, freeze the pay of federal employees. They're overpaid compared to state and local and private employees. Freeze their pay. Well, you know, we say things like this all the time. Doesn't necessarily mean anybody's going to pay any attention. As it turned out, A reporter at USA Today picked up on this idea. He started writing about it frequently on the front page, mostly about the high pay of federal employees and the growing calls for a freeze. And we got a federal pay freeze passed by Congress. And according to our calculations, it has saved the taxpayers in the past 3 years $90 billion. So I don't even think of that as a big idea, and yet it saved $90 billion. At Kansas Policy, an example of that, I think, is this discovery that school districts were holding something like $900 million in unencumbered school cash reserves. That is, money they had, but were not spending, even as they were lobbying the legislature for more money. That's the sort of thing that at one level is not the big idea, like let parents choose the schools their children go to, but is an idea that can save taxpayers a lot of money. And one of the things I think these cases illustrate is think tanks produce a lot of ideas. And you never know which ones may catch on. And that's a reason to keep on putting out ideas, hoping that some of them will attract the attention of somebody in the media, of somebody in the legislature or Congress, or even of the people, like term limits. That did not attract a lot of attention in Congress. It did attract the attention of a lot of people. And in that way, doing these things, we in the think tank world are renewing the culture of liberty that runs very deep in America. We can get depressed a lot of times, but the fact is that America was formed by people who wanted to escape repressive regimes in other parts of the world, and it still is. And that really helps to imbue the American people, the American spirit, with the idea of liberty. There are two very distinguished scholars from Ivy League universities who don't much like freedom, who wrote a whole book on how freedom wasn't a good idea, and near the end of it complained that nevertheless, despite what we've proved, these ideas of liberty and individualism are astonishingly widespread in American culture. And they're right about that. The American heritage of liberty is still there, but it needs a voice. And one of the things that we do, and lots of other organizations are also trying to do, is provide that voice, organize people, provide information to people. David Kirby and I have done research that suggests that, given a fairly loose definition, 20 to 40 million Americans think the government should stay out of the economy and out of our personal lives. We call that the libertarian vote. That doesn't mean they vote for the Libertarian Party. It doesn't necessarily mean they vote for any particular candidate. But they are people whose fundamental view of the world ought to sort of tie them together. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't think of themselves as being part of a group with other people like that. We're not reaching enough of them. We need to find them and rally them and give them an identification. This is who you are. You are the people who support liberty, and these are the leaders that you should be looking to for a political movement, political influence. Now, we're think tanks, and that means we don't organize political campaigns. At least at Cato, we're very strict about not lobbying. That would be illegal. We also think it's inadvisable for us because we want to be perceived as independent and nonpartisan. We do sober, responsible policy studies. That's our contribution to the world. But we should remember that we do them because we care about the people whose lives are affected by government that exceeds its proper bonds. And also remember that the difficulties we face in getting our message out are nothing like those our friends in other countries face. And when I think about the things we go through and the things other people go through to defend liberty in their countries, I think of people like a college student named Yang Zi Li, who recently completed 8 years in a Chinese jail for reading Hayek and writing about the rule of law. Or Karim Amer, who spent 4 years in an Egyptian jail for blogging about the oppression of women and Christians in Egypt. Or Attila Yala, exiled from his home in Turkey because he dared to raise political questions in public about the nature of the Turkish state. And even in gentle, peaceful Canada, there's a conservative writer there named Ezra Levant who was summoned before the government to be interrogated by an agent of the state about the opinions he expressed and why he expressed them. He didn't go to jail. If he did, he didn't go to an Egyptian jail. But to be questioned in a free society, in a liberal society, about why you expressed the opinions you expressed is very dangerous. But we don't worry just about those who suffer for exercising their right to free speech. We speak for all those who suffer under the burdens of government. People like Shelley Parker, who had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to win the right to own a gun to protect herself in a dangerous D.C. neighborhood. Or Suzette Kelo, whose home was taken from her by a partnership between big business and big government. I'm sure Bob has heard the idea of public-private partnership a lot here in Wichita. It was a public-private partnership that took Suzette Kelo's home. Or Katherine Johnston, a 92-year-old woman killed by police officers who burst into her house in the middle of the night because they had the wrong address for a marijuana dealer who didn't exist in the first place. And beyond that, all the elderly folks trying to get by on Social Security because they weren't allowed to save for their retirement and invest their savings in real wealth. People like this remind us of what the founders told us, that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. And in this day and age, when we hope we won't have to take up arms in the defense of freedom, eternal vigilance is expressed and exercised by all the Americans who devote their time and money and effort to defending and expanding freedom. And sometimes people wonder if what think tanks do is important. Politics, they say, that's where the action is. Get out and do things, hold rallies, elect people to office. It's a valuable thing to do. If politics is your calling, go to it. But it's not the only thing. And my friend Joe Lehman of the Mackinac Center said recently, when lawmakers change public policy to favor liberty, they are only taking the final step in a long march. Watching what lawmakers accomplish in the legislature is like watching a football game through a hole in the fence that only lets you see the goal line. The possibility of scoring is usually determined by what happened already far up the field. The guys who carry the ball across the goal line do get the glory and the best endorsement deals and the photo ops and the fan clubs. But without the guys who set them up to make the big play, there wouldn't be much scoring going on. Up the field and further away from the goal line glory is where ideas begin their march toward becoming public policy. And those ideas are developed and communicated by think tanks. And that's why we're here. The founders pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to the cause of American freedom. We don't have to do that, but we do have to do what we do, because freedom isn't free. It must be defended in every generation. James Madison warned us in the Federalist Papers, enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm. Well, he was right about that. And that's why we can't rely on politicians and political campaigns. That's why we need institutions that work to advance the ideas of liberty and limited government, no matter who's in the White House or the State House. And that's why you are a hero of the revolution. Everyone who's here, everyone who's a supporter of the Kansas Policy Institute, because these institutions can't survive without your help. I'm going to Chicago Saturday to speak to a regional student libertarian conference, Students for Liberty. And I'm going to tell them about the statue in downtown Chicago of George Washington, flanked by two of the great funders of the American Revolution, Robert Morris and Haym Salomon. That statue should be the emblem of the freedom movement, because without financial support, visionaries and leaders and institutions can't achieve much. So my colleagues at Cato and my friends at the Kansas Policy Institute, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being our partners in everything we do. And we're going to ask you to keep doing it, because there's never been a golden age of liberty, and there never will be. There will always be people who want to live their lives in peace, and there will always be people who want to exploit them or impose their ideas on others. That is, there will always be a conflict between liberty and power. And that's why we'll always need a movement for freedom. With all due respect to the many elected officials who are here, and I'm very impressed to see so many of them here, we can't count on politicians to protect freedom. It's up to us. So in the final analysis, that's why we're here. Thank you for being here. Thank you.